So, for our final installment in Colliding Cultures, we'll be discussing the British. So, the British, much like the French as well as the Dutch, were heavily influenced by the Black Legend, right? And so the British would utilize the Black Legend as a means to interrupt Spain's strongholds in the Americas. And so, in the name of justice, so to speak, um, we begin to see the British seizing treasure from Spanish ships. They were staging raids on Spanish ports and cities in the Americas, and also enlisting runaway enslaved Africans, known as cimarrones, to prey upon the Spanish. And Protestant England claimed that they would strike a blow against Spain's aggressive Catholicism and rescue the indigenous peoples from Spanish slavery. Mind you, they're saying all of this, however, they are still engaging in the transatlantic slave trade and also even selling some of the enslaved Africans they encounter to the Spanish. And also, their track record with indigenous peoples isn't really that much better. And so we see the Black Legend being utilized as a justification for the British to engage in colonization. However, the true motive was a system called mercantilism. This system of mercantilism is one that we talk about most commonly with Britain, but was also being utilized by other colonial forces as well. And so, mercantilism, simply put, is an economic system of trade which spanned from the 1500s through the 1700s, and it was based upon the idea that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and trade. So let's say you have a parent who decides they are going to strategically raise their children to go into certain professions in order to basically make the parent wealthy, right? And also for the family, really the mother, the parent, to be the most self-sufficient, right? So what that can look like is this. So in this image on the left-hand side, you see a mother country, and she's being brought gold and silver by one colony, food by another colony, raw materials by another colony. And so basically these colonies are extensions of her, right? They are her children. She is the mother. And the resources that the mother country is receiving are making her extraordinarily wealthy. But also, as a result, she is able to do more exporting in terms of trade than importing, which means she's far less in need of resources because she's able to export, right? She has items to trade as opposed to having to be reliant upon receiving certain resources. And so this was the job, by and large, of the colonies, was to make the mother country rich. And this system of keeping everything in house basically is called mercantilism, because the goal was it was basically the scramble for the wealthiest nation. And this was a great means to do so. And this even would negatively impact different colonies because the colonies were not encouraged to trade with one another. Even if they were closer by, right, they would have to trade with the mother country instead, right? Otherwise, there would be higher taxes for them and tariffs. As we mentioned a moment ago, early English ventures in the New World were truly a form of state-sponsored piracy. You have Queen Elizabeth sponsoring what were called sea dogs to plunder Spanish ships and towns in the Americas. The English employed similar tactics that it used in colonizing Ireland to the New World. Rather than integrating with the Irish or trying to convert them to Protestantism, you see England far more often to simply seize the land through violence and push out the former inhabitants, leaving them to move elsewhere or die. They turned around and employed the same tactics in North American invasions, which is why we can further see that this whole notion of being incensed by the Black Legend and the poor treatment of indigenous peoples was merely a facade, right? In order to get into the game of colonization of North Americas. And so there's a couple of early attempts of the British attempting to settle or to establish settlements or colonies. The first was Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who labored as best he could throughout the late 1500s to establish a colony in Newfoundland, but it failed. And it largely failed because of him, because of poor organization, which then led to desertion, and then also due to the climate, there were a lot of storms that destroyed infrastructure. The second attempt was established by John White in 1587, and he established a settlement on Roanoke Island. There were 150 English colonizers. Mostly they were men. And John White, he left the settlement on Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of North Carolina. And there were supply shortages, which prompted White to have to return to England for additional support. However, due to issues with the Spanish Armada, the mobilization of British naval efforts, he was stranded in Britain for several years. So when he finally returned to Roanoke, he found the colony was completely abandoned, and the only thing he could find was the word Croatoan carved into a tree or a post in the abandoned colony. And so it is believed that the peoples either fled the island, or they turned to the Croatan people for help, and decided to integrate into indigenous society, or they all died. We don't know. Much like the Dutch East and West India Companies, we see the Virginia Company of London being established in 1606. And the goal of the Virginia Company was to bring profit to its shareholders and to establish an English colony in the New World. And so the Virginia Company was a joint stock company, which meant that groups of investors would pool their resources to subsidize their voyages. And so basically, they would share in both profits as well as in losses. The company was royally sanctioned. King James I granted the company a royal charter for colonial endeavors in North America, and as a result, we see the founding of Jamestown. So Jamestown was the first successful colony established by the British in 1607. So the English sailed 40 miles up the James River in present-day Virginia and settled a seemingly uninhabited peninsula that was near many indigenous villages. Unfortunately, they had bad. So the colonizers of Jamestown settled in the midst of the Powhatan Confederacy, which was comprised of a series of indigenous nations of the area. They were named the Powhatan Confederacy for the powerful chief Powhatan, right? And so Jamestown was truly a startup, like the way that we hear about startups in Silicon Valley. That was Jamestown, in the sense that you had people who were really coming to Jamestown thinking they could engage in a get-rich-quick scheme, right? They could find lots of gold, find lots of resources, and then pretty much go back home. And so upon arrival, they didn't really bother themselves with the the necessities of living. So you have John Smith, who even states that, they would rather starve than work. There definitely was like a superiority complex because many of these people who were coming to Jamestown were elite, right? And so they were very much too cute to get their gloves dirty to farm, right? And so they didn't. And so we see more than half of the colonists of Jamestown dying within the first 9 months. From 1609 to 1610, there was the starving winter, where because they really didn't prepare for winter, they didn't have a harvest of crops, right? Which then meant they didn't have any food. I mean, it was so bad that you have many of these gentlemen and women engaging in acts of cannibalism. where, for example, one man's wife died in bed next to him, and he ate her body to stay alive. And so by 1616, 80% of all English settlers in Jamestown had died. And thankfully, you had the discovery that tobacco grows extremely well in Jamestown. And so thus it becomes the first cash crop of the British colonies. And so with the success of tobacco, requires labor. And so we see in 1619, and so with the success of tobacco, we also see a rise in the demand for labor, right? Because these elite men and women are not doing it. And so we see the development of indentured servitude, that consists of, and so we see this usage of indentured labor, initially from indigenous peoples, then Europeans, and then in 1619, 20 kidnapped Africans arrive at Jamestown. And so we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So in New England in 1620, we see the Pilgrims establishing Plymouth Colony. You have the Puritans, who largely dominated New England's politics, religion, and culture. And most of the colonists of New England arrived in family or familial groups. So in 1630, we see the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded. Connecticut was founded in 1636, and then Rhode Island also in the same year. And so to talk a little bit more about who the Puritans were, so approximately 20,000 Puritans came to North America. They believed themselves to be forming a godly community that would be an example for reformers back home. And even though they had been persecuted, they were not that interested in religious tolerance. Initially, the term Puritan had begun as an insult, meaning the godly, but then the name kind of just stuck. And the Puritans believed that the Church of England didn't distance itself enough from Catholicism after Henry VIII broke with Rome, and this was one of their primary points of contention. They believed that humankind was redeemed by God's grace and God's grace alone. And some aspects of this included the belief that the fate of the individual's immortal soul was predestined, and also that those who were of that number were considered to be the minority that had been chosen to be saved by God. They were considered to be the elect. And the Puritans largely disdained excess, right? So they were not dressing themselves in flashy clothing or obsessed with material acquisitions, because such excesses were seen as sinful. Okay, so we're going to pause ourselves here, and I hope you guys are having a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.